What's up, YouTube people? Shaggy the Writer coming at you live with the final library stream of Cancer season. We're once again continuing with George Orwell's 1984, literally 1984. So, yeah, just remember to hit that like button and subscribe. We're going to be picking up where we left off yesterday. So thank you so much to our viewers. Just all kinds of love to Against the World G, who will probably be in the building shortly. Also, big shouts out to the r/alternate history hub Discord server. You guys are so dope. As always, we're doing sub for sub. Mad love to Rockin' Brittany. Mad love to Marie. Mad love to Spart, Neeson the Noodle King. Crap, I can't think of the Italian dude's name, and I feel bad because he wanted me to read it. But just mad love to everybody at the Alternate History Hub Discord. We're picking up right where we left off. If I can find the place quick enough. But, oh yeah, let me not forget, shout out Octawave. Shouts out Marie. Shouts out, God, there's a lot of people. Don't watch Continue. Never forget Continue. Dog Rose. Winston was dreaming of his mother. He thought, have been about 10 or 11 years old when his mother had disappeared. She was a tall, statuesque, rather silent woman with slow movements and magnificent fair hair. His father, he remembered more vaguely, as dark and thin, dressed always in neat clothes. Winston remembered especially the thin soles of his father's shoes, and wearing spectacles. Two of them must evidently have been swallowed up in one of the first great purges of the 50s. At that moment his mother was sitting in some place deep down beneath him with his young sister in her arms. He did not remember his sister at all, except as a tiny, feeble baby, always silent, with large, watchful eyes. Both of them were looking up at him. They were down in some subterranean place, the bottom of a well, for instance, or a very deep grave. But it was a place which, already far below him, was itself moving downwards. They were in the saloon of a sinking ship, looking up at him through darkening water. There was still air in the saloon. They could still see him and he them, but all while they were sinking down into the green waters, which in another moment must hide them from sight forever. He was out in the air and light while they were being sucked down to death, and they were down because he was up here. He knew it, and they knew it. He could see the knowledge in their faces. There was no reproach either in their faces or in their hearts, only the knowledge that they must die in order that he might remain alive, and that this was part of the unavoidable order of things. He could not remember what happened, but he knew in his dream that in some way the lives of his mother and his sister had been sacrificed to his own. It was one of those dreams which, while retaining the characteristic dream scenery, are a continuation of one's intellectual life, and in which one becomes aware of the facts and ideas which still seem new and valuable after one is awake. The thing that now suddenly struck Winston was that his mother's death nearly 30 years ago had been tragic and sorrowful in a way that was no longer possible. Tragedy, he perceived, belonged to an ancient time, to a time when there was still privacy, love, and friendship, and when the members of a family stood by one another without needing to know the reason. His mother's memory tore at his heart because she had died loving him, when he was too small and selfish to love her in return, and because somehow he did not remember how she had sacrificed herself to a conception of loyalty that was private and unalterable. Such things, he saw, could not happen today. Today there was fear, hatred, and pain, but no dignity, emotion, or deep or complex sorrows. All this he seemed to see in the large eyes of his mother and sister, looking up at him through the green water, hundreds of fathoms down and still sinking. Suddenly he was standing on short, spongy turf, on a summer evening when the slanting rays of sun glided the ground. The landscape that he was looking at recurred so often in his dreams that he was never fully certain whether or not he had seen it in the real world. In his waking thoughts he called it Golden Country. It was an old, rabbit-bitten pasture with a foot track wandering across it, and a mere hole here and there. In the ragged hedge on the opposite side of the field, the boughs of elm trees were swaying very faintly with the breeze, their leaves just stirring in dense masses like women's hair. Somewhere near at hand, though out of sight, there was a clear, slow-moving stream, where it danced and swimming pools under the willow trees. The girl with dark hair was coming toward him across the field with what still seemed like a single movement. She tore off her clothes and flung it then disdainfully aside. Her body was white and smooth, but aroused no desire in him. Indeed, he barely looked at it. What overwhelmed him in that instant was admiration for the gesture in which she had thrown her clothes aside. With its grace and carelessness, it seemed to annihilate a whole culture, a whole system of thought, as though Big Brother and the party and the thought police could all be swept into nothingness by a single splendid movement of the arm. That, too, was a gesture belonging to an ancient time. Winston woke up with the word Shakespeare on his lips. The telescreen was giving forth an ear-splitting whistle which continued on the same note for 30 seconds. It was not 7:15, getting up time for office workers. Winston wrenched his body out of bed, naked, for a member of the outer party received only 3,000 clothing coupons annually, and a suit of pajamas was 600, and seized a dingy singlet and a pair of shoes that were laying across a chair. The physical jerks would begin in 3 minutes. The next moment he was doubled up by a violent coughing fit which nearly always attacked him soon after waking up. It emptied his lungs so completely that he could only begin breathing again by lying on his back and taking a series of deep gasps. His veins had swelled with the effort of the cough, and the varicose ulcer had started itching. 30 to 40 group, yapped a piercing female voice. 30 to 40 group, take your places, please. 30s to 40s. Winston sprang to attention in front of the telescreen, upon which the image of a youngish woman, scrawny but muscular, dressed in a tunic and gym shoes, had already appeared. Arms bending and stretching, she rapped out. Take your time by me. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Come on, comrades. Put a bit of life into it. 1, 2, 3, 4. The pain of the coughing fit had not quite driven out of Winston's mind the impression made by his dream, and the rhythmic movements of the exercise restored it somewhat. As he mechanically shot his arms back and forth, wearing on his face a look of grim enjoyment, which was considered proper during the physical jerks, he was struggling to think of his way backward into the dim period of his early childhood. It was extraordinarily difficult. Beyond the late 50s, everything faded, when there were no external records that you could refer to. Even the outline of your own life lost its sharpness. You remembered huge events which had probably not happened. You remembered the details of incidents without being able to recapture their atmosphere. There were long, blank periods to which you could assign nothing. Everything had been different then. Even the names of the countries and their shapes on the map had been different. Airstrip 1, for instance, had been called differently in these days. It was England or Britain, though London, he felt fairly certain, had always been called London. Winston could not definitely remember a time when the country had not been at war, but it was evident that there had been no fairly long interval of peace during his childhood, because one of his early memories was an air raid which appeared to take everyone by surprise. Perhaps it was the time when the atomic bomb had fallen on Colchester. He did not remember the raid itself, but he did remember his father's hand clutching his own as they hurried down into some place deep in the earth, round and round a spiral staircase which rang under his feet, and which finally so wearied his legs that he began whimpering and they had to stop and rest. His mother, in her slow, dreamy way, was following a long way behind them. She was carrying his baby sister. Oh, man. Or perhaps it was only a bundle of blankets that she was carrying. He was not certain of whether his sister had been born then. Finally, they emerged in a noisy, crowded place, which he realized to be a tube station. Shouts out Renzo Flutes for showing up. The best shakuhachi player in all of wherever he's at in Japan. I'm sorry, I forgot we were at Japan. Mad love to Renzo Flutes. He's a Leo, and their season's coming up. This is our last hurrah, basically. But mad love to you doing your thing over there. Yes, and my book does finally have reviews now, and it's easier to find. And it only took like almost a year and $1,000, but there were people sitting all over the stone-flagged floor, and other people packed tightly together were sitting on metal bunks, one above the other. Winston and his mother and father found themselves a place on the floor, and near them an old man and old woman were sitting side by side on a bunk. The man had on a decent shirt and a black cloth cap pushed back from very white hair. His face was scarlet and his eyes were blue and full of tears. He reeked of gin. It seemed he could breathe out of his skin in place of sweat. And one could have fancied that the others welling from his eyes were pure gin. But though slightly drunk, he was also suffering under some grief that was genuine and unbearable. In his childish way, Winston grasped that some terrible thing, something that was beyond forgiveness and could never be remedied, had just happened. It also seemed to him that he knew what it was. Someone whom the old man loved, a little granddaughter perhaps, had been killed. Every few minutes the old man would keep repeating, "We didn't know you trusted him. I said so, didn't I? That's what come of trusting him. I said so all along. We didn't vote to have trusted the buggers." Which buggers they did not have trusted, Winston could now remember. Since about that time, war had been literally continuous, though strictly speaking it had not always been the same war. For several months during his childhood, there had been confused street fighting in London itself, some of which he remembered vividly, but to trace out the history of the whole period, to say who was fighting whom at any given moment, would have been utterly impossible, since no written record, no spoken word, ever made mention of any alignment other than the existing one. At this moment, for example, in 1984, if it was 1984, Oceania was at war with Eurasia and in alliance with East Asia, and no public or private utterance was ever admitted that the three powers had at any time been grouped along different lines. Actually, as Winston well knew, it was only 4 years since Oceania had been at war with East Asia and in alliance with Eurasia, but that was merely a piece of figurative knowledge which he happened to possess because his memory was not satisfactorily under control. Officially, the change of partners had never happened. Oceania was at war with Eurasia, therefore Oceania had always been at war with Eurasia. The enemy of the moment always represented absolute evil. Good Lord. And it followed that any past or future agreement with him was impossible. The frightening thing, he reflected for the 10,000th time, as he forced his shoulders painfully backward with hands on hips. They were gyrating their bodies from the waist, an exercise that was supposed to be good for back muscles. The frightening thing was that it all might be true. If the party could thrust its hands into the past and say of this or that, it never happened, that surely was more terrifying than torture and death. The party said that Oceania had never been in alliance with Eurasia. He, Winston Smith, knew that Oceania had been in alliance with Eurasia as short a time as 4 years ago. But did that knowledge exist? Only in his own consciousness, which in any case must soon be annihilated. And if all others accepted the lie which the party imposed, if all records told the same tale, then the lie passed into history and became truth. Who controls the past, ran the party slogan, controls the future. Oh, wait, I messed that up. Controls the present, controls the past. Okay, so you control the future, control the present, and control the past. The page break just killed me right there. Yeah, the past, though, its nature alterable, had never been altered. Whatever was true now, from an everlasting to everlasting, it was quite simple. All that was needed was an unending series of victories over your own memory. Reality control, they called it in Newspeak. Doublethink. Stand easy, barked the instructress a little more genially. Winston sank his arms to his sides and slowly refilled his lungs with air. His mind slid into the labyrinth world of doublethink. To know and not to know. To be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies. To hold simultaneously two opinions which canceled out, knowing them to be contradictory and believing in both of them. To use logic against logic. To repudiate memory while laying claim to it, and believing that democracy was impossible and that the party was the guardian of democracy. To forget whatever it was necessary to forget, and to draw it back into memory again at the moment when it was needed, then promptly forget it again, and above all, to apply the same process to the process itself. That was the ultimate subtlety, consciously to induce unconsciousness and then once again to become unconscious of the act of hypnosis you had just performed. Even to understand the word doublethink involved the use of doublethink. The instructress had called them to attention again. Now let's see which one of us can touch our toes, she said enthusiastically. Right over from the hips, please, comrades. 1, 2, 1, 2. Winston loathed this exercise, which sent shooting pains all the way from his heels to his buttocks and often ended by bringing on another coughing fit. The half-pleasant quality went with his meditations. The past, he reflected, had not merely been altered, it had actually been destroyed. For how could you establish even the most obvious fact when there existed no record outside of your own memory? He tried to remember in what year he had first heard mention of Big Brother. He thought it must have been sometime in the 60s, but it was impossible to be certain. The party historians, of course. Big Brother figured as the leader and the guardian of the revolution since its very earliest days. His exploits had been gradually pushed backwards in time until they already extended into the fabulous world of the 40s and the 30s, when the capitalists in their strange cylindrical hats rode through the streets of London in great gleaming motor cars or horse carriages with glass sides. There was no knowing how much of this legend was true and how much was invented. Winston could not remember what the date of the party itself it came into existence. He did not believe he'd ever heard the word Ingsoc before 1960, but it was possible that in its old speak form, English socialism, that is to say, it had been current earlier. Everything melted into mist. Sometimes, indeed, you could put your finger on a definite lie. It was not true, for example, as was claimed by the party history books, that the party had invented airplanes. He remembered airplanes since his earliest childhood, but you could prove nothing. There was never any evidence. Just once his whole life he had held in his hands unmistakable documentary proof of the falsification of a historical fact. And on that occasion, Smith, steamed a shrewish voice from the telescreen. 6079, Smith W. Yes, you. Bend lower, please. You can do better than that. You're not trying. Lower, please. That's better, comrade. Now stand at ease, the whole squad, and watch me. Sudden hot sweat had broken out all over Winston's body. His face remained completely inscrutable. Never showed dismay. Never showed resentment. A single flicker of the eyes could give you away. He stood watching while the instructress raised her arms above her own head. and one could not say gracefully, but with remarkable neatness and efficiently, bent over and tucked the first joint of her fingers under her toes.
There, comrades, that's how I want to see you doing it. Watch me again. I'm 39 and I've had 4 children. Now you look.
She bent over.
You see, my knees aren't bent. You can all do it if you want to,
She adds as her straightening herself up.
Anyone under 45 is perfectly capable of touching his toes. We don't all have the privilege of fighting in the front line, but at least we can all keep fit. Remember our boys on the Malabar front, the sailors in the floating fortresses. Just think what they have to put up with. Now try again. That's better, comrade. Much better,
she added encouragingly. At Winston, with a violent lunge, succeeded in touching his toes with knees unbent for the first time in several years. Oh, man. So that's chapter 3. But real quick, I did not hype up enough the fact that Renzo Flutes is in the building before. So huge shouts out to the best shakuhachi man in Nara, Japan. Oh, man. Oh, man. But, yeah. Mad love to Renzo Flutes and the rest of the Japan gang. You know, there is Zach and Tony as well sometimes come on these videos. So just know you are loved here too. Renzo's birthday coming up, so y'all can get him the present of helping him reach 20 or 30,000 subscribers before his birthday. I feel like it's very doable, and we have the clout to do it. Yo, Tony was just at your house. That's what's up. That's what's up. I hope he complimented that garden, because that is the dopest garden. Hope I can make it out there too. Yes. But also, I don't know if he's joined in yet or if he's still taking his nap or what. But shouts out. I think most people are jealous of that garden, let's be honest. But, oh man, just all kinds of love to the r/alternate history hub Discord. I'm going to have to vote in your poll here in a moment, I guess. Hang on. There we go. Oh my goodness, yes. Yeah, it's too bad they have kind of weird attitudes about certain things in Japan. But, you know, I mean, I guess it's worthy of the sacrifice to take in such an awesome culture. Also, I might just have a little in my bag when I come over there in a year or so. You know how we roll. And that's actually very good because Japan has been kind of backwards on a lot of stuff lately, and they're like supposed to be at the forefront of everything because they're Japan. But I guess that's how they probably think of America. Like, oh wow, you guys are so backwards on so many things. You're supposed to be at the forefront of everything. Why do you suck so much, America? I don't know. If we knew, we might not suck so much. But one more time, shouts out to the r/alternate history hub. Yeah, I think that mostly that's just because we have a lot of like significantly older people who are still in charge of a lot of things. A lot of significantly older people who are still in charge of a lot of things. But yes, have a great evening. I'm going to get back into this because we on chapter 4, and that's the only thing that's reading is oh, and that's the only thing. Every time. I'm gonna always do that. But yeah, huge shouts out to Renzo Flutes, y'all. Make sure you go sub to him. Mad love. Y'all are probably going to get legal herb before we get it here. Just saying. Oh, Uncle Joe moving mighty slow. It's chapter 4. With the deep, unconscious side, which not even the nearness of the telescreen could prevent him from uttering when his day's work started, Winston pulled the speak right toward him, blew the dust from its mouthpiece, and put on his spectacles. Then he unrolled and clipped together 4 small cylinders of paper, which had already flopped out of the pneumatic tube on the right-hand side of his desk. In the walls of the cubicle there were 3 orifices. To the right of the speakwrite, a small pneumatic tube for written messages. To the left, a larger one for newspapers. And on the side wall, within easy reach of Winston's arm, a large oblong slip protected by wire grating. This last one was for the disposal of waste paper. Similar slits existed in thousands or tens of thousands throughout the building, not only in every room, but at short intervals in every corridor. For some reason, they were nicknamed memory holes. When one knew the document was due for any sort of destruction, or even when a scrap of waste paper was lying about, it was an automatic action to lift the flap of the nearest memory hole and drop it in, whereupon it would be whirled away in a current of warm air to an enormous furnace that was hidden somewhere in the recesses of the building. Winston examined each of the 4 slips of paper which held unrolled. Each contained a message of only 1 or 2 lines in abbreviated jargon, not actually newspeak, but consisting largely of newspeak words, which was used in the ministry for internal purposes. They ran, Times, 7384, BB speech mal-reported Africa rectify. Times, 1912, 83, forecast 3YP 4th quarter 83 misprints verify current issue. Times, 14/2, 84, many plenty mal-quoted chocolate rectify. Times, 3/12, 83, reporting BB day order double plus ungood refs persons rewrite unsub anti-filing. With a feeling of faint satisfaction, Winston laid forth the message aside. It was an intricate and responsible job and had to be dealt with last. The other 3 were routine matters, though the second one would probably mean some tedious wadding through lists of figures. Winston dialed back numbers on the telescreen and called for appropriate issues of the Times, which slid out of the pneumatic tube after only a few minutes' delay. The messages he had received referred to articles or news items which for one reason or another was thought necessary to alter, or, as the official phrase had it, to rectify. For example, it appeared from the Times of the 7th of March that Big Brother in his speech of the previous day had predicted that the South Indian front would remain quiet, but that a Eurasian offensive would shortly be launched in North Africa. As it happened, the Eurasian Higher Command had launched an offensive in southern India and left North Africa alone. It was therefore necessary to rewrite a paragraph of Big Brother's speech in such a way as to make him predict that the thing had actually happened. Or again, the Times of the 19th of December had published the official forecasts of the output of various classes of consumption goods in the 4th quarter of 1983, which was also the 6th quarter of the 9th 3-year plan. Today's issue contained a statement of the actual output, from which it appeared that the forecasts were in every instance grossly wrong. Winston's job was to rectify the original figures by making them agree with the latter ones. As for the 3rd message, it referred to a very simple error which could be set right in a couple minutes. As a short time ago as February, the Ministry of Plenty had issued a promise, a categorical pledge were the official words, that there would be no reduction of chocolate ration during 1984. Actually, as Winston was aware, the chocolate ration was to be reduced from 30 grams to 20 at the end of the present week. All that was needed was a substitute for an original promise, a warning that it would probably be necessary to reduce the ration at some time in April. As soon as Winston had dealt with each of the messages, he clipped his speak-written corrections to the appropriate copy of the Times and pushed them into the pneumatic tube. Then, with a movement which was as nearly as possible unconscious, he crumpled up the original message and any notes that he himself had made and dropped them into a memory hole to be devoured by the flames. What happened in the unseen labyrinth to which pneumatic tubes led, he did not know in detail, but he did know in general terms. As soon as all the corrections which happened to be necessary in any particular number of the Times had been assembled and collated, that number would be reprinted, the original copy destroyed, and the corrected copy placed on the files in its stead. This process of continuous alteration was applied not only to newspapers, but to books, periodicals, pamphlets, posters, leaflets, films, soundtracks, cartoons, photographs, to every kind of literature or documentation which might conceivably hold any political or ideological significance. Day by day and almost minute by minute, the past was brought up to date. In this way, every prediction made by the party could be shown by documentary evidence to have been correct, nor was any item of news or any expression of opinion which conflicted with the needs of the moment ever allowed to remain on record. All history was a palimpsest, scraped clean and reinscribed exactly as was necessary. Palimpsest. Man. The other day, the other word was just a billy club, and I was stupid for not knowing that. And I feel like a palimpsest is going to end up just being a chalkboard or something when I look that up after. Shouts out Lorenzo Lutz. Shouts out Against the World. G. Shouts out all the fam over there at r/alternate history hub Discord. We in the building. We in full effect. Okay. Got to remember to look that up after. Day by day and almost minute by minute, the past was brought up to date in every way, and every prediction made by the party could be shown by documentary evidence to have been correct, nor was any item of news or any expression of opinion which conflicted with the needs of the moment ever allowed to remain on record. All history was palimpsest, scraped clean and reinscribed exactly as often as necessary. In no words would it have been possible, once the deed was done, to prove that any falsification had taken place. The largest section of records department, far larger than the one in which Winston worked, consistently simply of persons whose duty was to track down and collect all copies of books, newspapers, and other documents which had been superseded and were due for destruction. A number of the Times which might, because of changes in political alignment, or mistaken prophecies uttered by Big Brother, have been rewritten a dozen times, still stood on the files bearing its original dates, and no other copy existed to contradict it. Books also were recalled and rewritten again and again, and were invariably reissued without any admission that any alteration had ever been made. Even the written instructions which Winston received, and which he invariably got rid of as soon as he had dealt with them, never stated or implied the act of forgery was to be committed. Always the reference was to slips, errors, misprints, or misquotations, which it was necessary to put right in the interests of accuracy. But actually, he thought that as he readjusted the Ministry of Plenty's figures, it was not even forgery. It was merely the substitution of one piece of nonsense for another. Most of the material that you were dealing with had no connection with anything to the real world, not even the kind of connection that was contained in a direct lie. Statistics were just as much a fantasy in their original version as in their rectified version. A great deal of time you were expected to make them up out of your head. For example, the Ministry of Plenty's forecast had estimated the output of boots for the quarter at 145 million pairs. The actual output was given as 62 million. Winston, however, in rewriting the forecast, marked the figure down to 57 million, so as to allow for the usual claim of that quota had been overfilled. In any case, 62 millions was no nearer the truth than the 57 millions, or than 145 millions. Very likely no boots had been produced at all. Likelier still, nobody knew how many had been produced, much less cared. All one knew was that every quarter astronomical numbers of boots were produced on paper, while perhaps half the population of Oceania went barefoot. And so it was that every class of recorded fact, great or small, everything faded away into the shadow world, in which, finally, even the date of the year had become uncertain. Winston glanced across the hall. In the corresponding cubicle on the other side, a small, precise-looking, dark-chinned man named Tillotson was working steadily away, with a folded newspaper on his knee and his mouth very close to the mouthpiece of the speakwrite. He had the air for trying to keep what he was saying a secret between himself and the telescreen. He looked up. His spectacles darted a hostile flash in Winston's general direction. Winston hardly knew Tillotson. He had no idea what work he was employed on. People in the records department did not readily talk about their jobs. In the long, windowless hall with its double row of cubicles, an endless rustle of papers and hum of voices murmuring into speakwrites, there were quite a dozen people whom Winston did not even know by name, though he daily saw them hurrying to and fro in the corridors, gesticulating in the 2 minutes' hate. He knew that in the cubicle next to him, the little woman with sandy hair toiled day in and day out, simply at tracking down and deleting from the press the names of people who had been vaporized and were therefore considered never to have existed. There was a certain fitness in this, since her own husband had been vaporized a couple of years earlier, and a few cubicles away a mild, ineffectual, dreamy creature named Ampleforth, with very hairy ears and a surprising talent for juggling with rhymes and meters, was engaged in producing garbled versions, definitive texts they were called, of poems which had become ideologically offensive, but which, for one reason or another, were to be retained in the anthologies. And this hall, with its 50 workers or thereabouts, was only one subsection, a single cell, as it were, in the huge complexity of the records department. Beyond, above, below, were other swarms of workers engaged in unimaginable multitude of jobs. There were huge printing shops with their sub-editors, their typography experts, their elaborately equipped studios for the faking of photographs. There was the teleprogram section with its engineers, its producers, and its teams of actors specifically chosen for their skill in imitating voices. There were the armies of reference clerks whose job was simply to draw up lists of books and periodicals which were due for recall. There were vast repositories where the corrected documents were stored, and hidden furnaces where the original copies were destroyed. And somehow or another, quite anonymous, there were directing brains who controlled the whole effort and laid down the lines of policy which made it necessary that this fragment of the past should be preserved, and that one falsified, and the other rubbed out of existence. And the records department, after all, was itself only a single branch of the Ministry of Truth, whose primary job was not to reconstruct the past, but to supply the citizens of Oceania with newspapers, films, textbooks, telescreen programs, plays, novels, every conceivable kind of information, instruction, or entertainment, from statue to slogan, from lyric poem to biological treatise, and from a child's spelling book to a newspeak dictionary. And the ministry was not only to supply the multifarious needs of the party, it was to repeat the whole operation at a lower level for the benefit of the proletariat. There was a whole chain of separate departments dealing with proletarian literature, music, drama, and entertainment generally. Here were produced rubbishy newspapers containing Almost nothing except sport, crime, and astrology, sensational 5-cent novelettes, films oozing with sex, and sentimental songs which were composed entirely by mechanical means on some special kind of kaleidoscope known as a versificator. There was even a whole subsection, pornosec, it was called in newspeak, engaged in producing the lowest kinds of pornography, which sent out in sealed packets in which no party member, other than those who worked on it, was permitted to look at. 3 messages had slid out of the pneumatic tube while Winston was working, but they were simple matters. He disposed of them before the 2 minutes' hate interrupted him. When the hate was over, he returned to his cubicle, took the Newspeak dictionary from the shelf, and pushed the speakwrite to one side, cleaning his spectacles, and settled down to the main job of the morning. Winston's greatest pleasure in life was his work. Most of it was a tedious routine, but it included other jobs so difficult and intricate that you could lose yourself in them as in the depths of a mathematical problem, delicate pieces of forgery, which you had nothing to guide you except your knowledge and principles of ingsoc and your estimate of what the party wanted you to say. Winston was good at this kind of thing. Stupid library warnings. On occasion, he had even been entrusted with the rectification of the Times' leading articles, which were written entirely in newspeak. He unrolled the message that he had set aside earlier. It ran, Times, 3/12/83, reporting BB Day order, double plus ungood refs, unpersons, rewrite, fool wise, unsub, anti-filling. In old speak or standard English, this might have been rendered, the reporting of Big Brother's order for the day in the Times of December 3rd, 1938, is extremely unsatisfactory and makes references to non-existent persons. Rewrite it in full and submit your draft to higher authority before filing. Winston read through the offending article. Big Brother's order for the day, it seemed, had been chiefly devoted to praising the work of an organization known as FFCC, which supplies cigarettes and other comforts to sailors in the floating fortresses. A certain Comrade Withers, a prominent member of the inner party, had been singled out for special mission and awarded with decoration the Order of Conspicuous Merit, 2nd class. 3 months later, FFCC had suddenly been dissolved with no reasons given. One could assume that Withers and his associates were now in disgrace, but there had been no report of the matter in the press or on the telescreen. That was to be expected, since it was unusual for political offenders to be put on trial or even publicly denounced. The great purges involving thousands of people, with public trials of traitors and thought criminals who might abject confession to their crimes and were afterwards executed, were special showpieces, not occurring oftener than once in a couple of years. More commonly, people who had incurred the displeasure of the party simply disappeared and were never heard of again. One never had the smallest clue as to what had happened to them. In some cases, they might not even be dead. Perhaps 30 people personally known to Winston, not counting his parents, had disappeared at one time or another. Winston stroked his nose gently with a paper clip. In the cubicle across the way, Comrade Tillotson was still crouching secretly over his speakwrite. He raised his head for a moment. Again, the hostile spectacle flash. Winston wondered whether Comrade Tillotson was engaged in the same job as himself. It was perfectly possible. So tricky a piece of work would never be entrusted to a single person. On the other hand, to turn it over to a committee would be to admit openly that an act of fabrication was taking place. Very likely as many as a dozen people were now working on rival versions of what Big Brother had actually said. And presently some master brain in the inner party would select this version or that, would re-edit it and set in motion the complex processes of cross-referencing that would be required, and then chosen lie would pass onto permanent records and become truth. Winston did not know why Withers had been disgraced. Perhaps it was for corruption or incompetence. Perhaps Big Brother had merely been getting rid of the too popular subordinate. Perhaps Withers or someone close to him had been suspected of heretical tendencies. Or perhaps, what was likeliest of all, the thing that simply happened because purges and vaporizations were a necessary part of the mechanics of government. The only real clue lay in the words refs unpersons, which indicated that Withers was already dead. You cannot invariably assume this to be the case when people were arrested. Sometimes they were released and allowed to remain at liberty for as much as a year or so, or 2 years even, before being executed. Very occasionally, some persons whom you believed to be dead long since would make a ghostly reappearance at some public trial, where he would implicate hundreds of others by his testimony before vanishing, this time forever. Withers, however, was already an unperson. He did not exist. He had never existed. Winston decided that it would not be enough simply to reverse the tendency of Big Brother's speech. It was better to make it deal with something totally unconnected to the original subject. He might turn the speech into the usual denunciation of traitors and thought criminals, but that was a little too obvious. While to invent a victory on the front or some triumph over the production in their 3-year plan might complicate records too much. What was needed was a piece of pure fantasy. Suddenly there sprang into his mind, ready-made as it were, the image of a certain Comrade Ogilvy, who had recently died in battle in heroic circumstances. There were occasions when Big Brother devoted his order of the day for commemorating some humble, rank-and-file party member whose life and death he held up as an example worthy of being followed. Today he should commemorate Comrade Ogilvy. It was true that there was no such person as Comrade Ogilvy, but a few lines in print and a couple of fake paragraphs would soon bring him into existence. Winston thought for a moment, then pulled the speakwrite toward him and began dictating it in Big Brother's familiar style. A style at once military and pedantic, and because of a trick of asking questions and then promptly answering them. What lessons do we learn from this fact, comrades? The lessons, which is also one of the fundamental principles of Ingsoc, that, etc., etc., easy to imitate. At the age of 3, Conrad Ogilvy had refused all toys except a drum, a submachine gun, and a model helicopter. At 6, a year early, by a special relaxation of the rules, he had joined the spies. At 9, he had been a troop leader. At 11, he denounced his uncle to the thought police after overhearing a conversation which appeared to him to have criminal tendencies. At 17, he'd been a distinct organizer of the Junior Anti-Sex League. At 19, he had designed a hand grenade which had been adopted by the Ministry of Peace, and which at its first trial had killed 31 Eurasian prisoners in one burst. At 23, he had perished in action, pursued by enemy jet planes while flying over the Indian Ocean with important dispatches. He had weighted his body with machine gun and leapt out of the helicopter into the deep water, dispatches and all, on end, said Big Brother, which was impossible to contemplate without feelings of envy. Big Brother added a few remarks on the purity and single-mindedness of Comrade Ogilvy's life. He was a total abstainer and no smoker, and had no recreations except a daily hour in the gymnasium, and had taken a vow of celibacy, believing that marriage and the care of family to be incompatible with a 24-hour-a-day devotion to duty. He had no subjects of conversation except the principles of Ingsoc, and no aim in life except the defeat of the Eurasian enemy and the hunting down of spies, saboteurs, thought criminals, and traitors generally. Winston debated himself whether to award Comrade Ogilvy the Order of Conspicuous Merit, and in the end decided against it because of the unnecessary cross-referencing that it would entail. Once again, he glanced at his rival in the opposite cubicle. Something seemed to tell him that certainly Tillotson was busy doing the same job as himself. There was no way of knowing whose version would finally be adopted, but he felt a profound conviction that it would be his own. Comrade Agively, unimagined an hour ago, was now a fact. It struck him as curious that you could create dead men but not living ones. Comrade Agively, who had never existed in the present, now existed in the past. And when once the act of forgery was forgotten, he would exist just as authentically and upon the same evidence as Charlemagne or Julius Caesar. Ooh, that was a strong chapter. Oh man. Shouts out against the world. Gee. Probably still got Keenan in his house. Shouts out Keenan. And also, I think, shouts out AJ because I know his birthday coming up. And speaking of Leos, Renzo Flutes popped in for a whole chapter. So y'all make sure to go to subscribe to him as your birthday present to an OG in Nara, Japan. Mad love going out to the r/alternate history hub Discord team. Y'all are awesome. And we all looking forward to that contest result. I'll probably read the rest of Cody's book here this week. We're about halfway in, I think. Oh man, give me like 2 seconds. We got like an hour and a half before the library closes, so I feel like we could really tear something up here. But I'm still waiting to hear from Against the World. See if he still wanted me to come over his house and potentially read more while he plays video games, so that y'all get double the entertainment value for your non-existent dollars. Oh my goodness. I'm sure I'm missing people. I don't know if I'm going to do the full hour and a half at this, but I'm going to try. 3:52 minutes in, I'm already just like, whoo. But one of the greatest books in all of English literature, 1984, literally 1984. In the low-ceilinged canteen, deep underground, the lunch queue jerked slowly forward. The room was already full and deafeningly noisy. From the grill at the counter, the steam of stew came pouring forth, with a solid metallic smell which did not quite overcome the fumes of Victory Gin. On the far side of the room, there was a small bar, a mere hole in the wall where gin could be bought at 10 cents for a large nip. "We're just the man I was looking for," said a voice at Winston's back. He turned round to see his friend Sim, who worked in the research department. Perhaps friend was not exactly the right word. You didn't have friends nowadays, you had comrades. But there were some comrades whose society was pleasanter than that of others. Sim was a philologist, a specialist in newspeak. Indeed, he was one of the enormous team of experts now engaging in compiling the 11th edition of Newspeak Dictionary. He was a tiny creature, smaller than Winston, with dark hair and large, protuberant eyes, at once mournful and derisive, which seemed to search your face closely when he was speaking to you. "I wanted to ask you whether you got any razor blades," he said. "Not one," Winston said with a guilty haste. "I've tried all over the place. They don't any longer exist." Everyone kept asking you for razor blades. Actually, he'd 2 unused ones he was hoarding up. There had been a famine for them for the months. At any given moment, there was some necessary article which the party shops were unable to supply. Sometimes it was buttons, sometimes it was darning wool, sometimes it was shoelaces. At present, It was razor blades. You could get a hold of them, if at all, by scrounging more or less furtively on the free market. I've been using the same blade for 6 weeks, he added untruthfully. The queue gave another jerk forward. They halted and turned to face Sim again. Each of them took a greasy metal tray from a pile at the edge of the counter. "Did you go to see the prisoners hanged yesterday?" said Sim. "I was working," Winston said indifferently. "I shall see it on the flicks, I suppose." "A very inadequate substitute," said Sim. His mocking eyes rolled over Winston's face. "I know you," his eyes seemed to say. "I see through you. I know very well why you didn't go to see those prisoners hanged." In an intellectual way, Sim was venomously orthodox. He would talk with a disagreeable, gloating satisfaction of helicopter raids on enemy villages and trial and confessions of thought criminals, the executions in the cellars of the Ministry of Love. Talking to him was largely a matter of getting him away from such subjects and entangling him, if possible, in the technicalities of newspeak, on which he was authoritative and interesting. Winston turned his head a little to avoid the scrutiny of the dark, large eyes. "It was a good hanging," Sim said reminiscently. "I think it spoils it when they tie their feet together. I like to see them kicking, and above all, at the end, the tongue sticks right out. And blue, a quite bright blue, that's the detail that appeals to me." "Next, please," yelled the white apron prole with the ladle. Winston and Sim pushed their trays beneath the grill. On each was dumped swiftly the regulation lunch. Metal pannikin of pinkish-gray stew, a hunk of bread, a cube of cheese, and a mug of milkless Victory coffee, and one saccharin tablet. "There's a table under there, under the telescreen," said Sim. "Let's pick up a gin on the way." The gin was served out to them in handleless china mugs. They threaded their way across the crowded room and unpacked their trays onto the metal top table, on one corner of which someone had left a pool of stew, a filthy liquid mess that had appearance of vomit. Winston took his mug of gin, paused for an instant to collect his nerve, and gulped the oily-tasting stuff down. When he had winked his tears out of his eyes, he suddenly discovered that he was hungry. He began swallowing spoonfuls of stew, which, in among its general sloppiness, had cubes of spongy pinkish stuff which was probably a preparation of meat. Neither of them spoke again till they had emptied their pannikins. From the table at Winston's left, a little behind his back, someone was talking rapidly and continuously, a harsh gabble, almost like the quacking of a duck, which pierced the general uproar of the room. "How's the dictionary going?" said Winston, raising his voice to overcome the noise. "You slowly," said Sim. "I'm on the adjectives. It's fascinating." He brightened up immediately at the mention of newspeak. He pushed his pannikin aside, took up his hunk of bread in one delicate hand and cheese in the other, and leaned across the table so as to speak without shouting. "The 11th edition is the definitive edition," he said. "We're getting the language into its final shape, the shape it's going to have when nobody speaks anything else. We've finished with it. People like you will have to learn it all over again. I dare say that our job is inventing new words, but not a bit of it. We're destroying words. Scores of them, hundreds of them every day. We're cutting the language down to the bone. The 11th edition won't contain a single word that will become obsolete before the year 2050. He bit hungrily into his bread and swallowed a couple of mouthfuls, then continued speaking with a sort of pendant passion. His thin, dark face had become animated. His eyes had lost their mocking expression and grown almost dreamy. "It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words. Of course, the great wastage is in the verbs and adjectives, but there are hundreds of nouns that can be gotten rid of as well. It isn't the only synonyms, there are also the antonyms. For example, what justification is there for a word which is simply the opposite of some other words? Word contains in the opposite itself.
Take good, for instance. If you have a word like good, what need is there for a word like bad? Ungood will do just as well. Better, because it is an exact opposite, which the other is not. Or again, if you want a stronger version of good, what sense is there in having a whole string of vague, useless words like excellent, splendid, and the rest of them? Plus good covers the meaning, or double plus good if you want something stronger still. Of course, we use those forms already, but in the final version of Newspeak, there will be nothing else. In the end, the whole notion of goodness and badness will be covered by only 6 words. In reality, only 1 word. Don't you see the beauty in that, Winston? It was BB's idea originally, of course, he added as an afterthought. A sort of vapid eagerness flitted across Winston's face at the mention of Big Brother. Nevertheless, Sim immediately detected a certain lack of enthusiasm. You haven't a real appreciation of Newspeak, Winston, he said almost sadly. Even when you write it, you're still thinking in old speak. I've read some of those pieces that you write in the Times occasionally. They're good enough, but they're translations. In your heart, you'd prefer to stick to old speak, with its vagueness and useless shades of meaning. You don't grasp the beauty of the destruction of words, do you, now that Newspeak is the only language in the world whose vocabulary gets smaller every year? Winston did know that, of course. He smiled sympathetically. He hoped not trusting himself to speak. Sim bit off another fragment of the dark-colored bread, chewed it briefly, and went on. Don't you see that the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible, because there will be no words in which to express it. Every concept that can ever be needed will be expressed by exactly 1 word, with its meaning rigidly defined and all subsidiary meanings rubbed out and forgotten. Already in the 11th edition, we're not far from that point, but the process will still be continuing long after you or I are dead. Every year, fewer and fewer words, and the range of consciousness always a little smaller. Even now, of course, there is no reason or excuse for committing thought crime. It is merely a question of self-discipline, reality control. But in the end, there won't be any need even for that. The revolution will be complete when the language is perfect. Newspeak is Ingsoc, and Ingsoc is Newspeak, he added with a sort of mystical satisfaction. Has it ever occurred to you, Winston, that by the year 2050, at the very latest, not a single being alive who could understand such a conversation as we are having now? Except, began Winston doubtfully, and then stopped. It had been on the tip of his tongue to say, except the proles, but he checked himself, not feeling fully certain that his remark was not in some way unorthodox. Sim, however, had divined what he was about to say. Proles are not human beings, he said carelessly. By 2050, earlier probably, all real knowledge of old speak would have been destroyed. The whole literature of the past would have been destroyed. Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, Byron, they'll only exist in Newspeak versions, not merely changed into something different, but actually changed into something contradictory of what they used to be. Even the literature of the party will change. Even the slogans will change. How could you have a slogan like freedom is slavery when the concept of freedom has been abolished? The whole climate of thought will have been different. In fact, there will be no thought as we understand it now. Orthodoxy means not thinking or needing to think. Orthodoxy is unconsciousness. One of these days, thought Winston with a sudden deep conviction, Sim will be vaporized. He is too intelligent. He sees too clearly and speaks too plainly. The party does not like such people. One day he will disappear. It's written on his face. Winston had finished his bread and cheese. He turned a little sideways in his chair to drink his mug of coffee.
At the table on his left, the man with strident voice was still talking remorselessly away. A young woman who was perhaps his secretary, and who was sitting with her back to Winston, was listening to him, and seemed to be eagerly agreeing with everything that he said. From time to time, Winston caught some remark as,
"I think you're so right. I do so agree with you,"
uttered in a youthful and rather silly feminine voice. But the other voice never stopped for an instant, even when the girl was speaking. Winston knew that the man by sight. He had no more about him than he held some important post in the fiction department. He was a man of about 30, with a muscular throat and a large, mobile mouth. His head was thrown back a little, and because of the angle at which he was sitting, his spectacles caught the light and presented to Winston two blank discs instead of eyes. What was slightly horrible was that from the stream of sound that poured out of his mouth, it was almost impossible to distinguish a single word. Just once Winston caught a phrase, "complete and final elimination of Goldsteinism," jerked out very rapidly, as it seemed all in one piece, in a line cast solid. For the rest, it was just noise, a quack, quack, quacking. And yet, though you could not actually hear what the man was saying, you could not be in any doubts about his general nature. He might be denouncing Goldstein and demanding sterner measures against thought criminals and saboteurs. Excuse me. He might be fuming against the atrocities of the Eurasian army. He might be praising Big Brother for the heroes on the Malabar front. It made no difference. Whatever it was, you could be certain that every word of it was pure orthodoxy, pure Ingsoc. He watched the eyeless face with the jaw rapidly moving up and down. Winston had a curious feeling that this was not a real human being, but some kind of dummy. It was not a man's brain that was speaking, it was his larynx. The stuff that was coming out of him consisted of words, but it was not speech in a true sense. It was noise uttered in unconsciousness, something like the quacking of a duck. Sim had fallen silent for a moment, and with the handle of his spoon was tracing patterns in the puddle of stew. The voice from the other table quickly quacked rapidly on, easily audible in spite of the surrounding din. "There is a word in Newspeak," said Sim. "I don't know whether you know it. Duck speak. To quack like a duck. It is one of those interesting words that have two contradictory meanings. Applied to an opponent, it is abuse. Applied to someone you agree with, it is praise." Unquestionably, Sim will be vaporized, Winston thought again. He thought it with a kind of sadness, although he knew well that Sim despised him and slightly disliked him, and was fully capable of denouncing him as a thought criminal if he saw any reason for doing so. There was something subtly wrong with Sim. There was something he lacked. Discretion, aloofness, a sort of saving stupidity. You could not say that he was unorthodox. He believed in the principles of Ingsat. He venerated Big Brother. He rejoiced over victories. He hated heretics, not merely with sincerity, but a sort of restless zeal, and up-to-dateness of information, which the party member did not approach. Yet a faint air of disreputability always clung to him. He always said things that would have been better unsaid. He read too many books. He frequented the Chestnut Tree Cafe, haunt of painters and musicians. There was no law, not even an unwritten law, against frequenting the Chestnut Tree Cafe, yet the place was somehow ill-omened. The old discredited letters of the party had been used to gather there before they were finally purged. Goldstein himself, it was said, had sometimes been seen there years and decades ago. Sim's fate was not difficult to foresee. And yet it was a fact that if Sim grasped, even for 3 seconds, the nature of his, Winston's, secret opinions, he would betray him instantly to the thought police. So would anybody else, for that matter, but Sim more than most. Zeal was not enough. Orthodoxy was unconscious. Sim looked up. "Here comes Parsons," he said. Something in the tone of his voice seemed to add, "That bloody fool, Parsons." Winston's fellow tenant at the Victory Mansions was, in fact, threading his way across the room. The tubby, middle-sized man with fair hair and a frog-like face. At 35, he was already putting rolls of fat on neck and waistline, but his movements were brisk and boyish. His whole appearance was that of a little boy grown so much so that although he was wearing the regulation overalls, it was almost impossible not to be thinking of him as being dressed in blue shorts, gray shirt, and red neckerchief of the spies. In visualizing him, one saw always a picture of dimpled knees and sleeves rolled back from pudgy forearms. Parsons, indeed, invariably revert to shorts when a community hike or any physical activity gave him an excuse for doing so. He greeted them both with a cheery, "Hello, hello," and sat down at a table, giving off an intense smell of sweat. Beads of moisture stood out all over his pink face. His powers of sweating were extraordinary. At the community center, you could always tell when he had been playing table tennis by the dampness of the ball handle. Sim had produced a strip of paper on which there was a long column of words and was studying it in the ink pencil between his fingers. "You'll get him working away in the lunch hour," said Parsons, nudging Winston. "Keenly say, that's what you've got there, old boy. Something a bit too brainy for me, I expect. Smith, old boy, I'll tell you why I'm chasing you. It's that stub you forgot to give me." "Which stub is that?" said Winston, automatically feeling for money. About a quarter of one's salary had to be earmarked for voluntary subscriptions, which were so numerous that it was difficult to keep track of them. "For Hate Week. You know, the House Be House Farm. The House Be House Fund. I'm treasurer for our block. We're making an all-out effort, going to put on a tremendous show. I tell you, it won't be my fault if the old Victory Mansions doesn't have the biggest outfit of flags in the whole street. $2 you promised me." Winston found and handed over two creased and filthy notes, which Parsons had entered in a small notebook and handed neatly, writing of the illiterate. "By the way, old boy," he said, "I hear that little bagger of mine let fly at you with his catapult yesterday. I gave him a good dressing down for it. In fact, I told him I'd take the catapult away if he ever does it again." "I think he was a little upset at not going to the execution," said Winston. "Oh, well, what I meant to say shows the right spirit, doesn't it? Mischievous little buggers they are, both of them, but talk about keenness. All they think about is the spies in the war, of course. Do you know what that little girl of mine did Saturday when her troop was on a hike out Berkhamsted way? She got two other girls to go with her, slipped off from the hike, and spent the whole afternoon following a strange man. They kept on his tail for 2 hours right through the woods, and then when they got into Amersham, handed him over to the patrols." "What did they do that for?" said Winston, somewhat taken aback. Parsons went on triumphantly. "McKinn made sure he was some kind of enemy agent. Might have been dropped in by a parachute, for instance. But here's the point, old boy. Do you think he put her onto him in the first place? He spotted he was wearing a funny kind of shoes. Said she'd never seen anyone wearing shoes like that before. So the chances were he was a foreigner. Pretty smart for a nipper of 7, eh?" "What happened to the man?" said Winston. "I couldn't say, of course, but I wouldn't be altogether surprised if—" Parson made the motion of aiming a rifle and clicked his tongue for the explosion.
Well, good,
said Sim abstractly, without looking up from his strip of paper.
Of course we can't afford to take chances.
Oh, that was supposed to be Winston. Of course we can't afford to take chances, agreed Winston dutifully.
What I mean to say, there's a war on,
said Parsons, as though in confirmation to this. A trumpet call floated from the telescreen just above our heads. However, it was not the proclamation of a military victory this time, but merely an announcement from the Ministry of Plenty.
Comrades,
cried an eager, youthful voice.
Attention, comrades. We have glorious news for you. We've won the battle for production. Returns now completed of the output of all classes and consumption goods show that the standard of living is risen by no less than 20% over the past year. All over Oceania this morning, there were irresponsible, simultaneous demonstrations when workers marched out of factories and offices and paraded through the streets with banners voicing their gratitude to Big Brother for their new and happy life which his wise leadership has bestowed upon us. Here are some of the completed figures. Foodstuffs,
the phrase our new happy life, recurred several times, has been a favorite of late with the Ministry of Plenty. Parsons, his eager attention caught by the trumpet call, sat listening with a sort of gaping solemnity, a sort of edified boredom. He could not follow the figures, but he was aware that they were in some way a cause for satisfaction. He had lugged out a huge and filthy pipe which was already half full of charred tobacco. With the tobacco ration at 100 grams a week, it was seldom possible to fill a pipe up to the top. But Winston was smoking a Victory cigarette which he held up carefully horizontally. The new ration did not start till tomorrow, and he only had 4 cigarettes left. The moment he shut his ears to the remoter noises, was listening to the stuff that streamed out of the telescreen. It appeared that there had even been demonstrations to thank Big Brother for raising the chocolate ration to 20 grams a week. And only yesterday, he reflected, it had been announced that the ration was reduced to 20 grams a week. Was it possible that they could swallow that after only 24 hours? Yes, they swallowed it. Parsons swallowed it easily, with the stupidity of an animal. The eyeless creature at the other table swallowed it fanatically, passionately, with a furious desire to track down, denounce, and vaporize anyone who should suggest that last week the ration had been 30 grams. Sim, too, in some way more complex that involved doublethink, Sim swallowed it. Was he then alone in the possession of a memory? Fabulous statistics continued to pour out of the telescreen. As compared with last year, there was more food, more clothes, more houses, more furniture, more cooking pots, more fuel, more ships, more helicopters, more books, more babies, more of everything except disease, crime, and insanity. Year by year, minute by minute, everybody and everything was whizzing rapidly upwards. As Sim had done earlier, Winston had taken up his spoon and was dabbling in a pale-colored gravy that dribbled across the table, drawing a long streak of it out into the pattern. He meditated resentfully on the physical texture of life. Had it always been like this? Had food always tasted like this? He looked around the canteen, a low-ceilinged, crowded room, its walls grimy from contact of innumerable bodies, battered metal chairs and tables placed so close together that when you sat with elbows touching bent spoons, dented trays, coarse white mugs, all surfaces greasy, grime in every crack, and sourish composite smell of bad gin and bad coffee and metallic stew and dirty clothes. Always in your stomach and in your skin there was a sort of protest, a feeling that you had been cheated of something that you had a right to. It was true that he had no memories of anything greatly different. At any time that he could accurately remember, there had never been quite enough to eat. One never had socks or underclothes that were not full of holes. Furniture had always been battered and rickety, rooms underheated, tube trains crowded, houses falling to pieces. Bread dark colored, tea a rarity, coffee filthy tasting, cigarettes insufficient, nothing cheap and plentiful except synthetic gin. And though of course it grew worse as one's body aged, was it not a sign that this was not the natural order of things? If one's heart sickened at discomfort and dirt and scarcity, the interminable winters, the sickliness of one's socks, the lifts that never worked, the cold water and gritty soap, the cigarettes that came to pieces, the food with its strange evil tastes. Why should one feel it to be intolerable unless one had some kind of ancestral memory of things that had once been different? He looked around the canteen again. Nearly everyone was ugly, and would have still been ugly even if dressed otherwise than the uniform blue overalls. On the far side of the room, sitting at a table alone, a small, crusty, beetle-like man was drinking a cup of coffee, his little eyes darting suspicious glances from side to side. How easy it was, thought Winston, if you did not look about you, to believe that the physical type set up by the party is an ideal. Tall, muscular youths and deep-bosomed maidens, blonde-haired, vital, sunburnt, carefree, existed and even predominated. Actually, so far, as he could judge, the majority of people on Airstrip 1 were small, dark, and ill-favored. It was curious how the beetle-like type proliferated the ministries, little dumpy men growing stout very early in life, with short legs, swift scuttling movements, and fat inscrutable faces with very small eyes. It was that type that seemed to flourish best under the dominion of the party. Excuse me, I had to check my phone. The Ministry of the Plenty's announcement ended on another triumphant call and gave way to tinny music. Parsons, stirred to vague enthusiasm by the bombardment of figures, took his pipe out of his mouth. Ministry of Plenty certainly done a good job this year, he said with a knowing shake of his head. By the way, Smith, old boy, I suppose you haven't got any razor blades you can let me have? Not one, said Winston. I've been using the same blade for 6 weeks myself. Oh, well, just thought I'd ask you, old boy. Sorry, said Winston. The quackening voice from the next table, temporarily silenced during the ministry's announcement, had started up again, as loud as ever. For some reason, Winston suddenly found himself thinking of Mrs. Parsons, with her wispy hair in the dust and the creases of her face. Within 2 years, those children would denounce her to the thought police. Mrs. Parsons would be vaporized. Sim would be vaporized. Winston would be vaporized. O'Brien would be vaporized. Parsons, on the other hand, would never be vaporized. The eyeless creature with the quacking voice would never be vaporized. The little beetle-like men who scudded so nimbly through the labyrinth of corridors of ministries, they too would never be vaporized. A girl with dark hair, a girl from the fiction department, she would never be vaporized either. It seemed to him that he knew instinctively who would survive and who would perish, though just what it was that made for survival, it was not easy to say. At this moment, he was dragged out of his reverie with a violent jerk. The girl at the next table had turned partly round and was looking at him. It was the girl with dark hair. She was looking at him in a sidelong way, but with curious intensity. The instant that she caught his eye, she was looking away again. The sweat started out on Winston's backbone. A horrible pang of terror went through him. It was gone almost at once, but it left a sort of nagging uneasiness behind. Why was she watching him? Why did she keep following him about? Unfortunately, he could not remember whether she had already been at that table when he arrived, or had come there afterwards. But yesterday, at any rate, during the 2 minutes hate, she had sat immediately behind him when there was no apparent need to do so. Quite likely her real object had been to listen to him and make sure whether he would be shouting loudly enough. His earlier thought returned to him. Probably she was not actually a member of the thought police. But then it was precisely the amateur spy who was in greatest danger of all. He did not know how long she had been looking at him, but perhaps for as much as 5 minutes. It was possible that his features had not been perfectly well under control. It was terribly dangerous to let your thoughts wander when you were in any public place or within the range of a telescreen. The smallest thing could give you away: a nervous tic, an unconscious look of anxiety, a habit of muttering to yourself, anything that carried with it a suggestion of abnormality or having something to hide. In any case, to wear an improper expression on your face, to look incredulous when a victory is announced, for example, was itself a punishable offense. There was even a word for it in newspeak. Face crime, it was called. The girl turned her back on him again. Perhaps, after all, she was not really following him about. Perhaps it was coincidence that she had sat so close to him 2 days running. His cigarette had gone out, and he laid it carefully on the edge of the table. He would finish smoking it after work, if he could keep the tobacco in it. Quite likely the person at the next table was a spy of the thought police, and quite likely would be in the cellars of the Ministry of Love within 3 days. But a cigarette must not be wasted. Sim had folded his strip of paper and stowed it away in his pocket. Parsons had begun talking again. "Did I ever tell you, old boy," he said, clucking round the stem of his pipe, "about the time when those two nippers of mine set fire to the old woman's skirt because they saw her wrapping up sausages in a poster of BB? Sneaked up behind her and set fire to her with a box of matches. Burned her quite badly, I believe. Little beggars, eh? But keen as mustard. That's the first training they give 'em in the spies nowadays. Better than my day, even. What do you think the littlest thing they've served him with? Ear trumpets for listening to keyholes. My little girl brought one home the other night, tried it out on a sitting room, and I reckon she could hear twice as much as with her ear to the hole. Of course, it's only a toy, mind you. Still gives them the right idea, eh?" At this moment the telescreen let out a piercing whistle. It was the signal to return to work. All three men sprang to their feet, joined the struggle round the lifts, and the remaining tobacco fell out of Winston's cigarette. Oh, man. Ooh. Cancer gang. Cancer gang. George Orwell, 1984. If you haven't read this book yet, then I recommend doing it, even if you're hearing me read it live now. Because there are things I could be saying that are really being downplayed, because there are a lot of very important information inside this book. Because this man was literally killed the next year after he wrote this book. Now, I don't know if he was killed or if he died naturally. They say he died naturally, but 50 is not old. But yeah, one of the greatest cancer writers to ever write anything in the English language. I don't know if I said it yet on this break, but also Keenan and AJ, who are probably at his house, unless he is taking a nap currently. All kinds of love to Nissy Sizrup. All kinds of love to Rockin' Brittany. Man, Renzo Flutes actually showed up today, so make sure y'all go listen to some of his shakuhachi music. Anyone on the r/alternate history hub Discord whose name I haven't shouted out yet. Spart Henry, Gus. You hate when I call you Gus, and that's why I do it. Ha! But, Yeah, shouts out Don't Watch Continue and Dog Rose as well. Chapter 6. Winston was writing in his diary. It was 3 years ago. It was a dark evening in the narrow side street near one big railway station. She was standing near a doorway in the wall under a street lamp that hardly gave any light. She had a young face painted very thick. It was really the paint that appealed to me, the whiteness of it, like a mask, like the bright red lips. Party women never paint their faces. There was nobody else in the street and no telescreens. She said $2. For the moment, it was too difficult to go on. He shut his eyes and pressed his fingers against them, trying to squeeze out the vision that kept recurring. He had an almost overwhelming temptation to shout out a string of filthy words at the top of his voice, or to bang his head against the wall, or to kick over the table and hurl the inkpot through the window, to do any violent or noisy or painful thing that might black out the memory that was tormenting him. Your worst enemy, he reflected, was your own nervous system. At any moment, the tension inside you was liable to translate itself into some viable symptom. He thought of the man whom he looked past on the street a few weeks back. Quite ordinary-looking man, party member, age 35 or 40, tallish and thin, carrying a briefcase. They were a few meters apart when the left side of the man's face was suddenly contorted by a sort of spasm. Then it happened again, just as they were passing one another. It was only a twitch, a quiver, rapid as the clicking of a camera shutter, but obviously habitual. He remembered thinking at the time, that poor devil is done for. And what was frightening was that the action was quite possibly unconscious. The most deadly danger of all was talking in your sleep. There was no way of guarding against that, so far as he could see. He drew his breath and went on writing. I went with her through the doorway and came across a backyard into a basement kitchen. There was a bed against the wall, and the lamp at the table was turned down very low. His teeth were on edge. He would have liked to spit. Simultaneously with the woman in the basement kitchen, he thought of Catherine, his wife. Winston was married, had been married. At any rate, possibly he was still married, for so far as he knew, his wife was not dead. He seemed to breathe again his warm, stuffy odor of the basement kitchen, the odor compounded of bugs and dirty clothes and filling his cheap scent, but nevertheless alluring, because no woman of the party ever used scent, or could be imagined as doing so. Only proles used scent. In his mind, the smell was inextricably mixed up with fornication. When he'd gone with the woman, it had been his first lapse in 2 years or thereabouts. Consorting with prostitutes was forbidden, of course, but it was one of those rules that you could occasionally nerve yourself to break. It was dangerous, but it was not a life or death matter. To be caught with a prostitute might mean 5 years in a forced labor camp. Not more if you commit another offense. And it was very easy, provided that you could avoid being caught in the act. The poorer quarters swarmed with women who were ready to sell themselves. Some could even be purchased for a bottle of gin, which the proles were not supposed to drink. Tacitly, the party was even inclined to encourage prostitution as an outlet for instincts which could not altogether be suppressed. Mere debauchery did not matter very much, so long as it was furtive and joyless, and only involved the women of a submerged and despised class. The unforgivable crime was promiscuity between party members. But though this was one of the crimes that the accused in great purges invariably confessed to, it was difficult to imagine that any such thing was happening. The aim of the party was not merely to prevent men and women from forming loyalties that might not be able to control. Its real undeclared purpose was to remove all pleasures from the sexual act. Not love so much as eroticism was the enemy, inside marriage as well as outside it. All marriages between party members had to be approved by a committee appointed for the purpose, and though the principle was never clearly stated, permission was always refused if the couple concerned gave the impression of being physically attracted to one another. The only recognized purpose of marriage was to beget children for the service of the party. Sexual intercourse was to be looked on as a slightly disgusting minor operation, like having an enema. This again was never put into plain words, but in an indirect way it rubbed every party member from childhood onwards. There were even organizations such as the Junior Anti-Sex League, which advocated complete celibacy for both sexes. All children were begotten to artificial insemination, ArtSem it was called in newspeak, and brought up in public institutions. This, Winston was aware, was not meant altogether seriously, but somehow it fitted in with general knowledge of the party. The party was trying to kill the sex instinct, or if it could not be killed, then distort it and dirty it. He did not know why this was so, but it seemed natural that it should not be so. And so far as women were concerned, the party's efforts were largely successful. He thought again of Catherine. It must have been 9, 10, nearly 11 years since they had parted. It was curious how seldom he thought of her. For days at a time he was forgetting that he had ever been married. They had only been together for about 15 months. The party did not permit divorce, but rather encouraged separation in cases where there were no children. Catherine was tall, fair-haired girl, very straight, with splendid movements. She had a bold, aquiline face, a face that one might have called noble until one discovered that there was, as nearly as possible, nothing behind it. Very early in the married life he had decided, though perhaps it was early, that he knew more intimacy than he knew most people, that she had, without exception, the most stupid, vulgar, empty mind that he had ever encountered. She had not a thought in her head that was not a slogan, and there was no imbecility, absolutely none, that she was not capable of swallowing if the party handed out to her. The human soundtrack, he named her in his own mind. Yet he could have endured living with her if it had not been for just one thing: sex. As soon as he touched her, she seemed to wince and stiffen. To embrace her was like embracing jointed-witted image. What was strange was that even when she was clasping him against her, he had the feeling that she was simultaneously pushing him away with all her strength. The rigidity of her muscles managed to convey that impression. She would lie there with shut eyes, neither resisting nor cooperating, but submitting. It was extraordinarily embarrassing and, after a while, horrible. But even then he could have borne living with her if it had been agreed that they should remain celibate. But curiously enough, it was Catherine who refused this. They must, she said, produce a child if they could. So the performance continued to happen, once a week regularly, whenever it was not possible. She used to even remind him of it in the morning, as something which had to be done that evening, and which was not to be forgotten. She had 2 names for it. One was making a baby, the other was our duty for the party. Yes, she actually used that phrase. Quite soon he grew to have the feeling of positive dread when the appointed day came around, but luckily no child appeared. In the end, she agreed to give up trying, and was soon afterwards they parted. Winston sighed inaudibly. He picked up his pen again and wrote. She threw herself down on the bed, and at once, without any kind of preliminary, in the most coarse, horrible way you can imagine, pulled up her skirt. He saw himself standing there in the damp lamplight with the smell of bugs and sheep scent in his nostrils, and in his heart a feeling of defeat and resentment, which even at that moment was mixed up with the thought of Catherine's white body, frozen forever by the hypnotic power of the party. Why did it always have to be like this? Why could he not have a woman of his own instead of these filthy scuffles at intervals of years? But a real love affair was an almost unthinkable event. The women of the party were all alike. Chastity was deeply ingrained in them as per party loyalty. By careful early conditioning, by games in cold water, by the rubbish that was dinned into them at school and the spies in the youth league, by lectures, parades, songs, slogans, and martial music. The natural feeling had been driven out of them. His reason told him that there must be exceptions, but his heart did not believe it. They were all impregnable, as the party intended they should be. And what he wanted more than even to be loved was to break down the wall of virtue, even if it were only once in his whole life. The sexual act successfully performed was rebellion. Desire was thought crime. Even to have awakened Catherine, if he could have achieved it, would have been a sedition, although she was his wife. But the rest of the story had to be written down, he wrote. I turned up the lamp when I saw her in the light. After the darkness, the feeble light of a paraffin lamp seemed very bright. For the first time he could see the woman properly. He had taken a step toward her, then halted, full of lust and terror. He was painfully conscious of the risk he had taken in coming here. It was perfectly possible that the patrols would catch him on the way out. For that matter, they might be waiting outside the door at this moment. He went away without even doing what he had come here to do. It had to be written down. It had to be confessed. What he had suddenly seen in the lamplight was that the woman was old. The paint was plastered so thick on her face that it looked as though it might crack like a cardboard mask. There were streaks of white in her hair, but the truly dreadful detail was that her mouth had fallen a little open, revealing nothing except cavernous blackness. She had no teeth at all. He wrote hurriedly in scribbling handwriting. When I saw her in the light, she was quite old, 50 years at least, but I went ahead and did it just the same. He pressed his fingers against his eyelids again. He had written it down at last, but it made no difference. The therapy had not worked. The urge to shout filthy words at the top of his voice was just as strong as ever. Oh. Chapter 6. Oh my gosh. Man, shouts out Renzo Flutes, who showed up early, stayed for a good minute, and smashed the like button, which I encourage everyone to do. Big shouts out to Tony and Zach, who are probably going to be kicking it with him again very soon. Mad love goes out as always. G. As well as Keenan and AJ, if they're at his house and he's not asleep. I don't even know if they be getting on YouTube. Oh man, mad shouts out to r/alternate history hub Discord. Oh man, we getting through this. We getting through a lot. I'm debating about how much I got left in me. I think we're just going to do one more chapter and call it a night. Let me just get a stretch. I need to get a stretch on real quick. I'm just going to... Oh. Y'all are awesome, my viewers. Mad love to my viewers. As Don't Watch Continue would say, shouts out my whole fan base. Smash this stupid like button. But I do want to say something kind of real for just a moment. I hope that you guys are actually enjoying this book, because there's just so much written in here. It's not really meant to destroy socialism or make any specific style of government look better than any other. But it does show how easy it is, how little it takes for people to be under the sway of authoritarianism. And one thing we should definitely know going toward the future is that with less print media and more computers and more telescreens and more phones, we're going to get to a point where it's going to be very easy for people who control the media to actually, keep us from ever having evidence that something existed. It's kind of scary to think about, and I think that's why he wrote this, even though he got the time stream just a little bit too rushed. But just remember, you always have to think for yourself, and you always got to know how to read and treasure the written word, because that is the ultimate truth in this world, is the written word. It's more important than a lot of people like to give it credit for. We on chapter 8. We at the Anderson Library once again. Mad love to the Anderson Library for being awesome. If I get 2 more likes, we'll try and do chapter 9 as well before they close. I think we can do it. They got 45 minutes left. Go ahead, give me them 2 likes. Yes. Chapter 8. If there is hope, wrote Winston, it lies in the proles. If there was hope, it must lie in the proles. Because only there, in those swarming, disregarded masses, 85% of the population of Oceania, could the force to destroy the party ever be generated. The party could not be overthrown from within. If it had enemies, it had no way of coming together or even identifying one another. Even if the legendary brotherhood existed, it just as possibly might. It was inconceivable that its members could ever assemble in larger numbers than 2s and 3s. Rebellion meant a look in the eyes, an inflection in the voice, and at most an occasional whispered word. But the proles, if only they could somehow become conscious of their own strength, would have no need to conspire. They need only to rise up and shake themselves like a horse shaking off flies. If they could choose to blow up the party to pieces tomorrow morning, surely sooner or later it must occur to them to do it. And yet, he remembered how once he had been walking down the crowded street when a tremendous shout of hundreds of voices, women's voices, had burst from a side street a little way ahead. It was a great formidable cry of anger and despair, a deep loud "Oh!" that went humming on like a reverberation of a bell. His heart had leapt. It started, he thought, a riot. The proles are breaking loose at last. When he reached the spot, it was to see a mob of 200 or 300 women crowding around the stalls of a street market, with faces as tragic as though they had been doomed passengers on a sinking ship. But at this moment the general despair broke down into a multitude of individual quarrels. It appeared that one of the stalls had been selling tin saucepans. They were wretched, flimsy things, but cooking pots of any kind were always difficult to get. Now the supply had unexpectedly given out. The successful women, bumped and jostled by the rest, were trying to make off with their saucepans while dozens of others clambered round the stall, accusing the stall-keeper of favoritism and having more saucepans somewhere in the reserve. There was a fresh outburst of yells. 2 bloated women, one of them with her hair coming down, had got a hold of the same saucepan and were trying to tear it out from another's hands. For a moment they were both tugging, and then the handle came off. Winston watched them disgustedly, and yet, just for a moment, what was frightening power had sounded in the cry from only a few hundred throats. Why was it they could never shout like that about anything that mattered? Until they become conscious, they will never rebel, and until they have rebelled, they cannot become conscious. That, he reflected, might almost have been a transcription from one of the party textbooks. The party claimed, of course, to have liberated the proles from bondage. Before the revolution, they had been hideously oppressed by the capitalists. They had been starved and flogged. Women had been forced to work in the coal mines. Women still did work in the coal mines, as a matter of fact. Children had been sold into factories at the age of 6. But simultaneously true to the principles of doublethink, the party taught that the proles were natural inferiors who must be kept in subjugation like animals by the application of a few simple rules. In reality, very little was known about the proles. It was not necessary to know much, so long as they continued to work and breed, like other activities without importance. Left to themselves like cattle turned loose on the plains of Argentina, they had reverted to a style of life that appeared to be natural to them, a sort of ancestral pattern. They were born, they grew up in the gutters. They went to work at 12. They passed through a brief blossoming period of beauty and sexual desire. They married at 20. They were middle-aged at 30. They died for the most part at 60. Heavy physical work, the care of home and children, petty quarrels with neighbors, films, football, beer, and all above. Gambling filled up the horizon of their minds. To keep them in control was not difficult. A few agents of the thought police moved always among them, spreading false rumors and marking down and eliminating the few individuals who were judged capable of becoming dangerous. But no attempt was made to indoctrinate them with the ideology of the party. It was not desirable that the proles should have strong political feelings. All that was required of them was a primitive sense of patriotism, which could be appealed to whenever it was necessary to make them accept longer working hours or shorter rations. And even when they became discontented, as they sometimes did, their discontent led nowhere, because, being without general ideas, they could only focus on petty, specific grievances. The larger evils invariably escaped their notice. The great majority of the proles did not even have telescreens in their homes. Even the civil police interfered with them very little. There was a vast amount of criminality in London, a whole world within a world of thieves, bandits, prostitutes, drug peddlers, racketeers of every description. But since it all happened among the proles themselves, it was of no importance. In all questions of morals, they were allowed to follow their ancestral code. The sexual puritanism of the party was not imposed upon them. Promiscuity went unpunished. Divorce was permitted. For that matter, even religious worship would have been permitted if the proles showed any sign of needing or wanting it. They were beneath suspicion, as the party slogan put it. Proles and animals are free. Winston reached down and cautiously scratched his varicose ulcer. It had begun itching again. The thing you invariably came back to was the impossibility of knowing what life before the revolution had really been like. He took out of the drawer a copy of children's history textbook, which he had borrowed from Mrs. Parsons, and began copying a passage into the diary. In the old days, it ran, before the glorious revolution, London was not the most beautiful city that we know today. It was a dark, dirty, miserable place, where hardly anybody had enough to eat and where hundreds of thousands of poor people had no boots on their feet and not even a roof to sleep under. Children no older than you or I had to work 12 hours a day for cruel masters who flogged them with whips if they worked too slowly and fed them on nothing but stale bread crusts and waters. But in among this terrible poverty, there were just a few great big beautiful houses that were lived in by rich men who had as many as 30 servants to look after them. These rich men were called capitalists. They were fat, ugly men with wrinkled faces, like the one in the picture on the opposite page. You can see that he is dressed in a long black coat, which was called a frock coat, and a queer, shiny hat shaped like a stovepipe, which was called a top hat. This was the uniform of the capitalist, and no one else was allowed to wear it. The capitalists owned everything in the world, and everyone else was their slave. They owned all the land, all the houses, all the factories, and all the money. If anyone disobeyed them, they could throw them in prison or they could take their job away and starve them to death. With any ordinary person spoke to a capitalist, he had to cringe and bow to him, take off his cap and address him as sir. The chief of all the capitalists was called the king, but he knew the rest of the catalog. There would have been mentions of bishops in their lawn sleeves, the judges in their ermine robes, the pillory, the stocks, the treadmill, the cat o' nine tails, Lord Mayor's banquet, and the prejudice of kissing the Pope's toes. There was also something called jus primaire notaire, which would probably not be mentioned in a textbook for children. It was the law by which every capitalist had the right to sleep with any woman working in one of his factories. How could you tell how much of it was lies? It might be true that the average human being was better off now than he had been before the revolution. The only evidence to the contrary was the mute protest in your own bones, the indistinctive feeling that the conditions you lived in were intolerable, and at some other time they must have been different. It struck him that the only characteristic thing about modern life was not its cruelty and insecurity, but simply its bareness, its dinginess, its listlessness. Oh, man. Yeah. Life, if you looked about you, bore no resemblance, not only to the lies that streamed out of the telescreens, but even to the ideals of the party that it was trying to achieve. Great areas of it, even for a party member, were neutral and non-political, a matter of slogging through dreary jobs, fighting for a place on the tube, darning a worn-out sock, cadging a saccharin tablet, saving a cigarette end. The ideal set up by the party was something huge, terrible, and glittering, a world of steel and concrete, of monstrous machines and terrifying weapons, a nation of warriors and fanatics marching forward in perfect unity, all thinking the same shouts and shouting the same slogans, perpetually working, fighting, triumphing, persecuting 300 million people, all with the same face. The reality was decaying, dingy cities where underfed people shuffled to and fro in leaky shoes and patched up 19th century houses that smelled always of cabbage and bad lavatories. He seemed to see a vision of London, vast and ruinous, a city of a million dustbins, and mixed up in it was a picture of Mrs. Parsons, a woman with lined face and wispy hair fiddling helplessly with a blocked waste pipe. He reached down and scratched his ankle again. Day and night the telescreens bruised your ears with statics proving that people today had more food, more clothes, better houses, better recreations, that they lived longer, worked shorter hours, were bigger, healthier, stronger, happier, more intelligent, better educated than the people of 50 years ago. Not a word of it could ever be proved or disproved. The party claimed, for example, that today 40% of adult proles were literate. Before the revolution, it was said the number had only been 15%. The party claimed that the infant mortality rate was now only 160 per thousand, whereas before the revolution it had been 300. And so it went on. It was like a single equation with two unknowns. It might very well be that literally every word in the history books, even the things that one accepted without question, were pure fantasy. For all he knew, they might not even have ever had such a thing as a law as the juris primae noctis, or that any creature capitalist, or any such garment as a top hat. Everything faded into a mist. The past was erased, the erasure was forgotten, the truth became lies, and the lies became truth. Just once in his life he had possessed, after the event, that was just what counted, concrete, unmistakable evidence of a falsification. He had held it between his fingers for as long as 30 seconds. In 1973, it must have been at any rate. It was about that time when he and Catherine had parted. But the relevant date was 7 or 8 years earlier. The story really began in the middle 60s, the period of great purges in which the original leaders of the revolution were wiped out once and for all. By 1970, none of them was left except Big Brother himself. All the rest by that time had been exposed as traitors and counter-revolutionaries. Goldstein had fled and was hiding. No one knew where, and of the others, a few had suddenly disappeared, while the majority had been executed after spectacular public trials at which they made confession of their crimes. Among the last survivors were 3 men named Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford. It must have been in 1965 that these 3 had been arrested. As often happened, they vanished for a year or more, so that one did not know whether they were alive or dead, and that suddenly had been brought forth to incriminate themselves in the usual way. They had confessed to counterintelligence with the enemy. At that date, too, the enemy was Eurasia. Embezzlement of public funds, murder of various trusted party members, intrigues against the leadership of Big Brother, which had started long before the revolution happened, and acts of sabotage causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. After confessing to these things, they had been pardoned, reinstated in the party, and given posts which were, in fact, sinecures, but which sounded important. All 3 had written long, abject articles in the Times, analyzing the reasons for their defection and promising to make amends. Sometime after their release, Winston had actually seen all of them in the Chestnut Tree Cafe. He remembered the sort of terrified fascination with which he watched them out of the corner of his eye. They were men far older than himself, relics of the ancient world, almost the last great figures left over from the heroic early days of the party. The glamour of the underground struggle and the Civil War was still faintly clinging to them. He had the feeling, though already at the time facts and dates were growing blurry, that he had known their names years earlier than he had known that of Big Brother. But also they were outlaws, enemies, untouchables, doomed with no absolute certainty to extinction within a year or two. No one who had fallen into the hands of the thought police ever escaped in the end. They were corpses waiting to be sent back to the grave. There was no one at any of the tables nearest to them. It was not wise to be seen in the neighborhood of such people. They were sitting in silence before the glasses of gin flavored with cloves, which had been the specialty of the cafe. Of the 3, it was Rutherford whose appearance had most impressed Winston. Rutherford had once been a famous caricaturist, whose brutal cartoons helped inflame popular opinion before and during the Revolution. Even now, at long intervals, his cartoons were still appearing sometimes in the Times. They were simply an imitation of his earlier manner, and curiously lifeless and unconvincing. Always they were rehashing of ancient themes: slum tenements, starving children, street battles, capitalists in top hats. Even on the barricades, the capitalists still seemed to cling to their top hats, an endless, hopeless effort to get back to the past. He was a monstrous man with a mane of greasy hair, his face pouched and seamed, with protuberant lips. At one time he must have been immensely strong. Now his great body was sagging, sloping, bulging, falling away at every direction. He seemed to be breaking up before one's eyes like a mountain crumbling. It was the lonely hour of 15. Winston could not remember how he had come to be in the cafe at such a time. The place was almost empty. The tinny music was trickling from the telescreens. 3 men sat in the corner amongst motionless, never speaking. Uncommanded, the waiter brought fresh glasses of gin. There was a chessboard on the table beside them with the pieces set out, but no game started. And then for perhaps half a minute in all, something happened to the telescreens. The tune that they were playing changed, and the tone of the music changed too. They came into it, but it was something hard to describe. It was a peculiar, cracked, braying, jeering note. In his mind, Winston called it a yellow note, but then a voice from the telescreen was singing. Under the spreading chestnut tree, I sold you and you sold me. I lie there lie we, under the spreading chestnut tree. The three men never stirred, but Winston glanced at Rutherford's ruinous face. This time he saw that his eyes were full of tears. For the first time he noticed, with a kind of inward shudder, and not yet knowing at what he shuddered, that both Aronson and Rutherford had broken noses. A little later, all three were rearrested. It appeared that they had engaged in fresh conspiracies from the moment of their release. At their second trial, they confessed to all their old crimes over again with a whole string of new ones. They were executed, and their fate was recorded in the party histories, a warning to posterity. About 5 years after this, in 1973, Winston was unrolling a wad of documents which had just flopped out of the pneumatic tube onto his desk when he came across a fragment of paper which had evidently been slipped in among the others and then forgotten. The instant he had flattened it out and saw its significance, it was a half page torn out of the Times about 10 years earlier, top half of the page, so that it concluded the date. It contained a paragraph, a photograph of the delegates at some party function in New York. Prominent in the middle of the group were Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford. There was no mistaking them. In any case, their names were in the caption at the bottom. The point was that at both trials, all three men had confessed on the date that they had been on Eurasian soil. They had flown in from a secret airfield in Canada to a rendezvous somewhere in Siberia, and had conferred with members of the Eurasian general's staff to whom they had betrayed important military secrets. The dates had stuck in Winston's memory because it chanced to be Midsummer Day. But the whole story must be on record in countless other places as well. There was only one possible conclusion: the confessions were lies. Of course, this was not in itself a discovery. Even at the time, Winston had not imagined that the people who were wiped out in the purges had actually committed the crimes that they were accused of. But this was concrete evidence. It was a fragment of the abolished past, like a fossil bone which turns up the wrong stratum and destroys a geological theory. It was enough to blow the party to atoms, if in some way he could have published it to the world and its significance had been made known. He had gone straight on working. As soon as he saw what the photograph was and what it meant, he covered it up with another sheet of paper. Luckily, when he unrolled it, it had been upside down from the point of view of the telescreen. He took the scribbling pad on his knee and pushed back his chair so as to get far enough away from the telescreen as possible. To keep your face expressionless was not difficult, and even your breathing could be controlled with an effort, but you could not control the beating of your heart, and the telescreen was quite delicate enough to pick it up. He let what he judged to be 10 minutes go by, tormented all the while by the fear that some accident, being sudden draught blowing across his desk, for instance, would betray him. Then, without uncovering it again, he dropped the photograph into the memory hole, along with some other waste papers. Within another minute, perhaps, it would have crumbled to ashes. That was 10, 11 years ago. Today, probably, he would have kept the photograph. He was curious that the fact of having held it in his fingers seemed to him to have made a difference even now, when the photograph itself, as well as the event recorded, was only a memory. Was the party's hold upon the past less strong, he wondered, because of a piece of evidence which had once existed? But today, supposing it could be somehow resurrected from its ashes, the photograph might not even be the evidence. Already, at the time when he made his discovery, Oceania was no longer at war with Eurasia, and it must have been the agents of Eurasia that the three dead men had betrayed to their country. Since then, there had been other changes. 2, 3, he could not remember how many. Very likely their confessions had been rewritten until the original facts and dates no longer had the smallest significance. The past had not only changed, but changed continuously. What most afflicted him was the sense of nightmare was that he had never clearly understood why the huge imposture was undertaken. The immediate advantages of falsifying the past were obvious, but the ultimate motive was mysterious. He took up his pen again and wrote, "I understand how. I do not understand why." He wondered, as he had many times wondered before, whether he himself was a lunatic. Perhaps a lunatic was simply a majority of one. At one time, he had been a sign of madness to believe that the earth goes round the sun, today to believe that the past is unalterable. He might be alone in holding that belief, and if alone, then a lunatic. The thought of being a lunatic did not greatly trouble him. The horror was that he might also be wrong. He picked up a children's history book and looked at the portrait of Big Brother, which formed its frontispiece. The hypnotic eyes gazed onto his own. It was as though some huge force were pressing down upon you, something that penetrated the inside of your skull, battering against your brain, frightening you out of your beliefs, persuading you almost to deny the evidence of your senses. In the end, the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. It was inevitable that they should make that claim sooner or later. The logic of their position demanded it, not merely the validity of experience, but the very existence of external reality was tacitly denied by their philosophy. The heresy of heresies was common sense. What was terrifying was not that they would kill you for thinking otherwise, but that they might be right. For after all, how do we know that 2 and 2 make 4? Or that the force of gravity works? Or that the past is unchangeable? If both the past and the external world only exist in the mind, and if the mind itself is controllable, what then? But no, his courage seemed suddenly to stiffen of its own accord. The face of O'Brien, not called up by any obvious association, had floated into his mind. He knew with more certainty than before that O'Brien was on his side. He was writing the diary for O'Brien, to O'Brien. It was like an interminable letter which no one person would ever read, but which was addressed to a particular person and took its color from that fact. The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. His heart sank as he thought of the enormous power arrayed against him, the ease with which any party intellectual would overthrow him in debate, the subtle arguments which he would not be able to understand, much less answer. And yet he was in the right. They were wrong, and he was right. It was obvious, silly, that the true had to be defended. Truisms are true. Hold on to that. The solid world exists. Its laws do not change. Stones are hard. Water is wet. Objects unsupported fall toward the earth's center. With the feeling that he was speaking to O'Brien, he also worked that he was setting forth an important axiom. He wrote, "Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 plus 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows." Oh, man. So, there we are. I was wrong. That was chapter 7, by the way. This is chapter 8. And we only got 7 minutes. So, I'm sorry, guys, but we're going to have to stop here at chapter 8. Because, wow, we're making really good progress, though. So, that is really awesome. Thank you so much to everyone who keeps tuning in and smashing that stupid like button. All kinds of love goes out to Against the World G, who I'm still going to try and get a hold of when I get off here. Shouts out to the r/. Alternate History Hub Discord server. Mad love to Renzo Flukes and the Japanese gang, who Renzo showed up for a minute. And that's very awesome of him. I got to go watch some more Shakuhachi now when I get out of the library. Let's see. As I did say, don't watch Continuing Dog Rose. Just all kinds of love to the r/alternate history hub Discord server. Marie always be tuning into these. Shouts out Marie. Shouts out Rakeem. Shouts out Brittany. Shouts out George Orwell. Cancer season. Last day of cancer season. Hoping that you guys are getting some true, awesome education out of this. But 5 minutes left on the computer, so I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Thank you so much to everyone for showing up today. One love, faux faith, NFA gang. Peace.